McCarthy leaned forward so suddenly he might have been propelled by a spring, and when he hung his head forward between his knees, Jonesy had a good idea of what was coming next. "So long, Navajo Rug. It's been good to know ya." The Beav clearly thought the same. He pulled back his legs, which had been splayed out before him, to keep them from being splattered. But instead of vomit, what came out of McCarthy was a long, low buzz. The sound of a factory machine which has been put under severe strain. McCarthy's eyes bulged from his face like glass marbles, and his cheeks were so taut that little crescents of shadow appeared under the corners of his eyes. It went on, a rumbling, rasping noise, and when it finally ceased, the Jenny outback seemed far too loud. "I have heard some mighty belches, but that's the all-time blue ribbon winner," Beav said. He spoke with quiet and sincere respect. McCarthy leaned back against the couch, eyes closing, mouth downturned in what Jonesy took of embarrassment, pain, or both. And once again he could smell that aroma of bananas and ether, a fermenting, active smell, like something which has just started to go over. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," McCarthy said, without opening his eyes. "I've been doing that all day, ever since light, and my stomach hurts again." Jonesy and Beav shared a silent, concerned look. "You know what I think?" Beaver asked. "I think you need to lie down and take you a little sleep. You were probably awake all night listening to that pesky bear and God knows what else. You're tired out and stressed out and fuck-a-duck knows what else out. You just need some shut-eye, a few hours, and you'll be right as the goddamn rain." McCarthy looked at Beaver with such wretched gratitude that Jonesy felt a little ashamed to be seeing it. Although McCarthy's complexion was still leaden, he had begun to break a sweat. Great big beads that formed on his brow and temples, and then ran down his cheeks like clear oil. This in spite of the cold air now circulating in the room. "You know," he said, "I bet you're right. I'm tired, that's all it is. My stomach hurts, but that's part's just stress. And I'm eating all sorts of things, bushes, and gosh, oh dear, I don't know, all sorts of things." He scratched his cheek. "Is this darn thing on my face bad? Is it bleeding?" "No," Jonesy said. "Just red." "It's a reaction," McCarthy said dolefully. "I get the same thing from peanuts. I'll lie down. That's the ticket, all right." He got to his feet, then tottered. Beaver and Jonesy both reached for him, but McCarthy steadied on his feet before either of them could take hold. Jonesy could have sworn that what he had taken for a middle-aged potbelly was almost gone. Was it possible? Could the man have passed that much gas? He didn't know. All he knew for sure was it had been a mighty fart and even a mightier belch, the sort of thing that you could yarn up on for 20 years or more. Starting off, we used to go up to Beaver's Clarendon camp the first week of hunting season every year, and one November, it was 2001, the year of the big fall storm, this fella wandered into camp. Yes, it would make a good story. People would laugh about the big fart and the big burp. People always laughed at stories about farts and burps. He couldn't tell the part about how he had come within 8 ounces of press on a Garand's trigger of taking McCarthy's life, though. No, he wouldn't want to tell that part, would he? Pete and Henry were doubling, and so Beaver led McCarthy to the other downstairs bedroom, the one Jonesy had been using. The Beav shot him a little apologetic look, and Jonesy shrugged. It was the logical place after all. Jonesy could double in with Beav tonight. Christ knew they had done it enough as kids, and in truth, he wasn't sure McCarthy would have managed the stairs anyway. He liked the man's sweaty, laden look less and less. Jonesy was the sort of a man who made his bed and then buried it. Books, papers, clothes, bags, sorted toiletries, he swept all this off as quickly as he could. Then turned back the coverlet. "Need to take a squirt, partner?" the Beav asked. McCarthy shook his head. He seemed almost hypnotized by the clean blue sheet Jonesy had uncovered. Jonesy was once again struck by how glassy the man's eyes were, like the eyes of a stuffed trophy head. Suddenly, And unbidden, he saw his living room back in Brooklyn, that upscale municipality next door to Boston. Braided rugs, early American furniture, and McCarthy's head mounted over the fireplace. Back that one up in Maine, he would have tell his guests at cocktail parties. Big bastard. Tried out at 170. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the Beav was looking at him with something like alarm. Twinge in the hip, he said. Sorry, Mr. McCarthy. Rick, you'll want to take off your sweater and pants. Boots too, of course. McCarthy looked around at him like a man roused from a dream. Sure, he said. You bet. Need help? Beaver asked. Oh gosh, no. McCarthy looked alarmed or amused or both. I'm not that far gone. Then I'll leave Jonesy to supervise. Beaver slipped out and McCarthy began to undress, starting by pulling his sweater off his head. Beneath it, he wore a red and black hunter's shirt, and beneath that a thermal undershirt. And yes, there was less gut poking out from the front of that shirt. Jonesy was sure of it. Well, almost sure. Only an hour ago, he reminded himself he had been sure McCarthy's coat was the head of a deer. McCarthy sat down in the chair beside the window to take off his shoes, and when he did, there was another fart. Not as long as the first one, but just as loud and hoarse. Neither of them commented on it or the resulting smell, which was strong enough in the little room to make Jonesy's eyes feel like watering. McCarthy kicked his boots off. They made clunking sounds on the wooden floor, then stood up and unbuckled his belt. As he pushed his blue jeans down, revealing the lower half of his thermal underwear, the Beav came back in with a ceramic pot from upstairs. He put it down by the head of the bed. Just in case you have to, irk. Or you get one of those collect calls you just have to take right away. McCarthy looked at him with a dullness Jonesy found alarming. A stranger in what had been his bedroom, somehow ghostly in his baggy long underwear. An ill stranger. The question was, just how ill? In case you can't make the bathroom, the Beav explained, which by the way is close by, just a bang outside the bedroom door. But remember, it's the second door as you go along the wall, okay? If you forget and go to the first one, you'll be taking a shit in the linen closet. Jonesy was surprised into a laugh and didn't care for the second of it in the slightest, high and slightly hysterical. I feel better now, McCarthy said, but Jonesy detected absolutely zero sincerity in the man's voice. And the guy just stood there in his underwear, like an android whose memory circuits have been about 3/4 erased. Before he had shown some life, not exactly vivacity, now that he was gone, like in the color of his cheeks. Go on, Rick, Beaver said quietly. Lie down and catch some wings. Work on getting your strength back. Yes, okay. He sat down on the freshly opened bed and looked out of the window. His eyes were wide and blank. Jonesy thought the smell in the room was dissipating, but perhaps he was just getting used to it. The way you got used to the smell of the monkey house at the zoo if you stayed in there long enough. Gosh, look at it, snow. Yeah, Jonesy said. How's your stomach now? Better. McCarthy's eyes moved to Jonesy's face. They were the solemn eyes of a frightened child. I'm sorry about passing gas that way. I never did anything like that before, not even in the army, when it seemed like we ate beans every day. But I feel better. Sure you don't need to take a leak before you turn in? Jonesy had 4 children, and this question came almost automatically. No, I went in the woods just before you found me. Thank you for taking me in. Thank you both. Ah, hell, Beaver said, and shuffled his feet uncomfortably. Anybody would have. Maybe, McCarthy said, and maybe not. In the Bible it says, Behold, I stand at the door and knock. Outside the wind gusted more fiercely yet, making hole in the wall shake. Jonesy waited for McCarthy to finish. It sounded as if he had more to say, but the man just swung his feet into bed and pulled the covers up. From somewhere deep in Jonesy's bed, there came another of those long rasping farts, and Jonesy decided that was enough for him. It was one thing to let in a wayfaring stranger when he came to your door, just ahead of the storm. It was another to stand around while he laid a series of gas bombs. The Beaver followed him out and closed the door gently behind him. 5. When Jonesy started to talk, the Beav shook his head, raised his finger to his lips, and led Jonesy across the big room to the kitchen, which was as far as they could get from McCarthy, without getting into the shed out back. "Man, that guy's in a world of hurt," Beaver said, and in harsh glow of kitchen's fluorescent strips, Jonesy could see how worried his old friend was. The Beav rummaged into the front pocket of his overalls, found a toothpick, and began to nibble on it. In 3 minutes, the length of time it took a dedicated smoker to finish a cigarette, he would reduce it to a palmful of flax-lined splinters. Jonesy didn't know how the Beav's teeth stood up to it, or his stomach, but he had been doing this his whole life. "I hope you're wrong," but Jonesy shook his head. "Did you ever smell anything like those farts?" "Nope," Beaver said. "But there's a lot going on with that guy than just a bad stomach." "What do you mean?" "Well, he thinks it's November 11th for one thing." Jonesy had no idea what the Beav was talking about. November 11th was the day their own hunting party had arrived, bundled into Henry's Scout, as always. "Beav, it's Wednesday. It's the 14th. Beav nodded, smiling a little in spite of himself. The toothpick, which had already picked up an appreciable warp, rolled from one side of his mouth to the other. "I know that. You know that, Rick. He don't know that. Rick thinks it's the Lord's Day." "Beav, what exactly did he say to you?" "Whatever it was, it couldn't have been much. It just didn't take that long to scramble a couple of eggs and heat a can of soup." That started a train of thought, and as Beaver talked, Jonesy ran water to do a few dishes. He didn't mind camping out, but he was damned if he was going to live in squalor, as so many men seemed willing to do when they left their homes and went into the woods. What he said was that they came up on Saturday so they could hunt a little, then spend Sunday working on the roof, which had a couple of leaks in it. He goes, "At least I didn't have to break the commandment about working on the Sabbath. When you are lost in the woods, the only thing you have to work on is not going crazy." "Huh?" Jonesy said. "I guess I couldn't swear in the court of law that he thinks this is the 11th, but it's either that or go back a week further to the 4th, because he sure does think it's Sunday, and I just can't believe he's been out there 10 days. Jonesy couldn't either, but 3? Yes, that he could believe. "It would explain something he told me," Jonesy said. The floor creaked and they both jumped a little, looking toward the closed bedroom door and on the other side of the big room, but there was nothing to see, and the floors and the walls were always creaking out here. Even when the wind wasn't blowing up high, they looked at each other a little shamefaced. "Yeah, I'm jumpy," Beaver said, perhaps reading Jonesy's face, perhaps picking the thought out of Jonesy's mind. "Man, you have to admit it's a little creepy, him turning up right out of the woods like that." "Yeah, it is." That fart sounded like he had something crammed up his butt that was dying of smoke inhalation. The Beav looked a little surprised at that, and he always did when he said something funny. They began laughing simultaneously, holding on to each other, and doing it through open mouths, expelling the sounds as a series of harsh sighs, trying to keep it down, not wanting the poor guy to hear them if he was still awake, hear and know they were laughing at him. Jonesy had a particularly hard time keeping it quiet because the release was so necessary. It had a hysterical severity to it, and he doubled over, gasping and snorting, water coming out of his eyes. At last, Beaver grabbed him and yanked him out of the door. There they stood coatless in the deepening snow, finally able to laugh out loud with the booming wind to cover the sounds they made. When they went back in again, Jonesy's hand was so numb he barely felt the hot water when he plunged his hand into it. But he was laughed out, and that was good. He wondered again about Pete and Henry, how they were doing, and if they'd make it back okay. "You said it explained some stuff," the Beav said. He had started another toothpick. "What stuff?" "He didn't know snow was coming," Jonesy said. He spoke slowly, trying to recall McCarthy's exact words. "So much for fair and seasonably cold. I think that's what he said. But that would make sense if the last forecast he heard was for the 11th or 12th. Because until late yesterday it was fair, wasn't it?" "Yeah, and seasonably fucking cold," Beaver agreed. He pulled a dish towel with a pattern of faded ladybugs on it from the drawer by the sink and began to dry the dishes. He looked across at the closed bedroom door as he worked. What else did he say? That their camp was in Kenio? Kenio? That's 40-50 miles west of here. Beaver took the toothpick out of his mouth, examined the bite marks on it, and put the other end in his mouth. Oh, I see. Yeah, he couldn't have done all that in a single night. But if he was out there for 3 days and 4 nights, if he got lost on Saturday afternoon, that makes 4 nights. Yeah, and 4 nights. So supposing he kept pretty much dead east that whole time, Jonesy calculated 15 miles a day. I'd say it's possible. But how come he didn't freeze? Beaver had lowered his voice to a near whisper, probably without even being aware of it. He's got a nice heavy coat and he's wearing longies, but nights have been in the 20s everywhere north of the country line since Halloween. So you tell me how he spends 4 nights out there and doesn't freeze. Doesn't even look like he's got any frostbite, just that mess on his cheek. I don't know, and there's something else, Jonesy said. How come he doesn't have the start of a beard? Huh? Beaver's mouth opened. The toothpick hung from his lower lip. Then very slowly he nodded. Yeah, all he's got is a stubble. I'd say less than a day's growth. Guess he was shaving, huh? Right, Jonesy said, picturing McCarthy lost in the woods, scared, cold and hungry. Not that he looked like he'd missed many meals, that was the other thing. But still kneeling by a stream every morning, breaking the ice with a booted foot, so he could get to the water beneath and take his trusty Gillette from where? His coat pocket. And then this morning he lost his razor, which is why he's got the stubble, the Beav said. He was smiling again, but there didn't seem to be a lot of humor in it. Yeah, same time he lost his gun. Did you see his teeth? Beaver made a what now grimace. 4 gone, 2 on top, 2 on bottom. He looks like the What Me Worry kid that's always on the front of the Mad magazine. Not a big deal, buddy. I've got a couple of AWOL choppers myself. Beaver hooked back one corner of his mouth, burying his left gum in the one-sided grin Jonesy could have done without. I'd back here. Jonesy shook his head. It wasn't the same. The guy's a lawyer, Beav. He's out in public all the time. His looks are a part of his living. And these babies are right out in front. He didn't know they were gone. I'd swear to it. You don't suppose he's got exposed to radiation or something, do you? Beaver asked uneasily. Your teeth fall out when you get fucking radiation poisoning. I saw that in a movie one time. One of the movies you are always watching, those monster shows. You don't suppose it's that, do you? Maybe he got the red mark at the same time. Yeah, he got the dose when the Mars Hill nuclear power plant blew up, Jonesy said. And Beaver's puzzled expression made him immediately sorry for the crack. Beav, when you get radiation poisoning, I think your hair falls out too. The Beaver's face cleared. Yeah, that's right. The guy in the movie ended up as bald as Telly. What's his fuck used to play the cop on TV? He paused. Then the guy died. The one in the movie, I mean, not Telly. Although now that I think of it. This guy's got plenty of hair. Jonesy interrupted. Let Beaver get off on the tangent, and they would likely never get back on the point. He noticed that, out of the stranger's presence, neither of them called him Rick or even McCarthy, just the guy, as if they subconsciously wanted to turn him into something less important than a man, something generic, as if that would make it matter less if. Yeah, Beaver said. He does, doesn't he? Plenty of hair. He must have amnesia. Yeah, but he remembers who he is, who he was with, shit like that. Man, that was some trumpet blast he blew, wasn't it? And the stink, like ether. Yeah, Jonesy said. I kept thinking of starter fluid. Diabetes get a smell when they are tipping over. I read that in a mystery novel, I think. Is it like starter fluid? I can't remember. Stood there looking at each other, listening to the wind. It crossed Jonesy's mind to tell Beaver about the lightning the guy claimed to have seen, but why bother? Enough was enough. I thought he was going to blow his cookies when he leaned forward like that, the Beav said. Didn't you? Jonesy nodded. And he don't look well, not at all well. No. Beaver sighed. tossed his toothpick in the trash, and looked out of the window where the snow was coming down harder and heavier than ever. He flicked his fingers through his hair. Man, I wish Henry and Pete were here. Henry especially. Beav, Henry is a psychiatrist. I know, but he's the closest thing to a doctor we have got, and I think that fellow needs doctoring. Henry actually was a physician, had to be, in order to get a certificate on shrinkology, but he'd never practiced anything except psychiatry as far as Jonesy knew. Still, he understood what Beaver meant. Do you think they'll make it back, Beav? Beav sighed. Half an hour ago, I would have said for sure, but it's really coming heavy. I think so. He looked at Jonesy somberly. There was not much of the usually happy-go-lucky Beaver Clarendon in that look. I hope so, he said. Chapter 3. Henry's Scout. 1. Now as he followed the scout's headlights through the thickening snow, burrowing as if through a tunnel along the deep-cut road toward hole in the wall, Henry was down to thinking about ways to do it. There was the Hemingway solution, of course. Way back at Harvard, as an undergraduate, he had written a paper calling it that, so he might have been thinking about it, in a personal way, not just as another step fulfilling some Twinkie course requirement. That was even then. The Hemingway solution was a shotgun, and Henry had one of those now. Not that he would do it here with the others. 4 of them had a lot of fine times at Hole in the Wall, and it would be unfair to do it there. It would pollute the place for Pete and Jonesy, for Beaver too, maybe Beaver most of all, and that wouldn't be right. But it would be soon. He could feel it coming on, something like a sneeze. Funny to compare the ending of your life to a sneeze, but that was probably what it came to. Just kerchoo! And then, hello darkness, my old friend. When implementing the Hemingway solution, you took off your shoe and your sock. The butt of the gun went on the floor, barrel went into your mouth, great toe went around the trigger. Memo to myself. Henry thought, as the scout fishtailed a little in the fresh snow, and he corrected, the ruts helped. And that was really all this road was, a couple of ruts dug by the skidders that used it in the summertime. If you do it that way, take a laxative, and do it until after that final dump. No need to make that extra mess for the people who find you. Maybe you better slow down a little, Pete said. He had a beer between his legs, and it was half gone. But one wouldn't be enough to mellow Pete out. 3 or 4 more, though, and Henry would go barrel-assing down his road at 60, and Pete would just sit there, in the passenger seat, singing along with one of those horrible fucking Pink Floyd discs, and he would go 60, without putting so much as another dink in the front bumper. Being in the ruts of the deep cut, even when they were filled with snow, was like being on rails. If it kept snowing, that might change, but for now, all was well. Don't worry, Pete, everything's 5 by 5. You want a beer? Not while I'm driving. Not even out here in West Overshoe. Later. Pete subsided, leaving Henry to follow the bore of the headlights to thread his way along his white lane between the trees, leaving him with his thoughts, which was where he wanted to be. It was like returning to the bloody place inside your mouth, exploring it again and again with the tip of your tongue, where it was where he wanted to be. There were pills. There was the old baggie over the head in the bathtub trick. There was drowning. There was jumping from a high place. The handgun in the air was too unsure. Too much of a chance of waking up paralyzed. And so was slitting the wrists. That was for people who were only practicing. But the Japanese had a way of doing it that interested Henry very much. Tie a rope around your neck. Tie the other end to a large rock. Put the rock on the seat of the chair. Then sit down with your back braced so that you can't fall backward but have to keep sitting. Tip the chair over and the rock rolls off. Subject may live to 3 or 5 minutes in a deepening dream of asphyxiation. Grey fades to black. Hello, darkness, my old friend. He had read about that method in one of Jonesy's beloved Kinsey Milhone detective novels, of all places. Detective novels and horror stories, those were the things that floated Jonesy's boat. On the whole, Henry leaned toward the Hemingway solution. Pete finished his first beer and popped the top of his second, looking considerably more content. What you make of it? Pete asked. Henry felt called to from that other universe, the one where the living actually wanted to live, as always these days. That made him feel impatient. But that was important that none of them suspect, and he had an idea Jonesy already did a little. Beaver might, too. There were the others who could sometimes see inside. Peter didn't have a clue, but he might say the wrong thing to one of the others about how preoccupied old Henry had gotten, like there was something on his mind, something heavy, and Henry didn't want that. This was going to be the last trip to Hole in the Wall for 4 of them, the old Kansas Street gang, the Crimson Pirates of the 3rd and 4th grades, and he wanted it to be a good one. He wanted them to be shocked when they heard, even Jonesy, who saw into him the most often and always had. He wanted them to say they had no idea. Better that than the 3 of them sitting around with their heads hung, not able to make eye contact with one another except in fleeting glances, thinking that they should have known they had seen the signs and should have done something. So they came back to the other universe simulating interest, smoothly and convincingly. Who could do that better than a head shrinker? What did I make of what? Pete rolled his eyes. At Gosselin's, dim bulb, all that stuff old man Gosselin was talking about. Peter, they don't call him old man Gosling for nothing. He's 80 if he's a day, and if there's one thing old women and old men are not short on, it's hysteria. The Scout, no spring chicken itself, 14 years old, and far onto its 2nd trip around the odometer, popped out of the ruts and immediately skidded. 4-wheel drive or not, Henry steered into the skid, almost laughing, when Pete dropped his beer onto the floor and yelled, "Oh fuck, watch out!" Henry let go of the gas until he felt the Scout start to straighten out, then zapped the go pedal again, deliberately too fast and too hard. The Scout went into another skid, this time the Widdershins stood the first and Pete yelled again. Henry let up once more and the Scout thumped back into the ruts and once again ran smoothly as if on rails. One positive to deciding to end your life, it seemed, was no longer sweating the small stuff. The lights cut through the white and shifting day, full of a billion dancing snowflakes, not one of them the same if you believe the conventional wisdom. Pete picked up his beer, only the little had spilled, and patted his chest. "Aren't you going a little fast?" "Not even close," Henry said. And then, as if the skid has never occurred, it had, or interrupted his train of thought, it hadn't, he went on. Group hysteria is the most common in the very old and the very young. It's a well-documented phenomenon in both my field and that of the sociology heathens who live next door. Henry glanced down and he saw he was doing 35, which was in fact a little too fast for these conditions. He slowed down. "Better?" Pete nodded. "Don't get me wrong, you're a great driver, but man, it's snowing. Also, we got the supplies." He jerked his thumb back over his shoulder at the 2 bags and the 2 boxes in the back seat. "In addition to hot dogs, we got the last 3 boxes of Kraft macaroni and cheese. Beaver can't live without that stuff, you know." "I know," Henry said. "I like it too. Remember those stories about devil worship in Washington state, the ones that made the press in the mid-90s? They were traced back to several old people living with their children, grandchildren, and in one case, in 2 small towns south of Seattle. The mass reports of sexual abuse in daycare centers apparently began with teenage girls working as part-time aides, crying wolf at the same time in Delaware and California. Possibly coincidence, or possibly the time was simply ripe for such stories to gain credence, and these girls caught a wave out of the air. How smoothly the words rolled out of his mouth, almost as if they mattered. Henry talked, the man beside him listened with dumb admiration, and no one, certainly not Pete, could have surmised that he was thinking of the shotgun, the rope, the exhaust pipe, the pills. His head was full of tape loops, that was all, and his tongue was the cassette player. "In Salem," Henry went on, "the old men and the young girls combined their hysteria, and voila, you have the Salem witch trials. I saw the movie with Jonesy," Pete said. "Vincent Price was in it. Scared the shit out of me." "I'm sure," Henry said and laughed. And for one wild moment he thought Pete was talking about the Crucible. And when are the hysterical ideas most likely to gain credence? Once the crops are in and the bad weather closes down, of course. And then there's time for telling stories and making mischief. In Wenatchee, Washington, it's devil worship and child sacrifices in the woods. In Salem, it was witches. And in the Jefferson Tract, home of the one and only Gosselin's Market, its strange lights in the sky, missing hunters and troop maneuvers, not to mention weird red stuff growing on the trees. I don't know about the helicopters and the soldiers, but enough people have seen those lights, and so they are having a special town meeting. Old man Gosselin told me so while you were getting the canned stuff. Also, those folks over Kenyo way are really missing. That ain't hysteria. 4 quick points, Henry said. First, you can't have a town meeting in the Jefferson Tract because there's no town. Even Kenyo is just an unincorporated township with a name. Second, the meeting will be held around Old Man Gosselin's Franken stove, and half of those attending will be short on peppermint schnapps or coffee brandy. Pete snickered. Third, what else have they got to do? And fourth, this concerns the hunters. They probably either got tired of it and went home, or they all got drunk and decided to get rich at the Res Casino up in Carabasset. You think, huh? Pete looked crestfallen, and Henry felt a great wave of affection for him. He reached over and patted Pete's knee. Never fear, he said. The world is full of strange things. If the world had really been full of strange things, Henry doubted he would have been so eager to leave it. But if there was one thing a psychiatrist knew how to do, other than write prescriptions for Prozac and Paxil and Ambien, it was tell lies. 4 hunters all disappearing at the same time seems pretty strange to me, all right. Not one bit, Henry said and laughed. 1 would be odd, 2 would be strange, 4, they went off together, depend on it. How far are we from hole in the wall, Henry? Which, when translated, meant, do I have time for another beer? Henry had zeroed the scout's trip meter at Gosselin's, an old habit that went back to his days working at the state of Massachusetts, where the deal have been 12 cents a mile, and all the psychotic geriatrics you could write up. The mileage between the store and the hole was easy enough to remember, 20.2. The odometer currently read 12.7, which meant, "Look out!" Pete shouted, and Henry snapped his gaze back to the windshield. The scout had just topped the steep rise of a tree-covered ridge. The snow here was thicker than ever. But Henry was running with the high beams on and clearly saw the person sitting in the road about 100 feet ahead. A person wearing a duffel coat, an orange vest that blew backward like a Superman's cape in the strengthening wind, and one of those Russian fur hats. Orange ribbons had been attached to that hat. They also blew back in the wind, reminding Henry of the streamers you sometimes saw strung over used car lots. The guy was sitting in the middle of the road like an Indian that wants to smoke peace pipe, and he did not move when the headlights struck him. For one moment, Henry saw the sitting figure's eyes wide open, but still, so still, and bright and blank, and he thought, that's how my eyes would look if I didn't guard them so closely. There was no time to stop, not with the snow. Henry twisted the wheel to the right and felt the thump as the scout came out of the ruts again. He caught another glimpse of the white, still face and had time to think. Why, goddamn, it's a woman! Once out of the ruts, the scout began to skid again at once. This time Henry turned against it, deliberately snow-plowing the wheels to deepen the skid. Knowing without even thinking about it, there was no time to think, and that was the road-sitter's only chance. And he didn't rate it much of one at that. Pete screamed, and from the corner of his eye, Henry saw him raise his hands in front of his face, palms out in a warding-off gesture. The scout tried to go broadside, and now Henry spun the wheel back, trying to control the skid just enough so that the rear end wouldn't smash the road-sitter's face backward into her skull. The wheel spun with greasy, giddy ease under his gloved hands. For perhaps 3 seconds, the scout shot down the snow-covered deep-cut road at a 45-degree angle, a thing belonging partly to Henry Devlin and partly to the storm. Snow flew up and around it in a fine spray. The headlights painted the snow-slumped pines on the left side of the road in a pair of moving spots. 3 seconds, not long, but just long enough. He saw the figure pass by, as if she were moving instead of them, except she never moved. Not even when the rusty edge of the scout's bumper flirted past her, with perhaps no more than an inch of snowy air between it and her face. "Missed you!" Henry exulted. "Missed you, you bitch!" Then the last thin thread of control broke, and the Scout broached broadside. There was a juddering vibration as the wheels found the ruts again, only crosswise this time. It was trying to turn all the way around, swapping ends. Front seas, back seas, they used to cry when in line back in grammar school. And then it hit a buried rock, or perhaps a fallen tree, with a terrific thud, and rolled over, first on the passenger side, the windows over there disintegrating into glittering crumbs, and then over onto the roof. One side of Henry's seatbelt broke, spilling him onto the roof on his left shoulder. His balls thumped against the steering column, producing instant leaden pain. The turn signal stalk broke off against his thigh, and he felt blood begin to run at once, soaking his jeans. The claret, as the old boxing radio announcers used to call it, as in, "Look out, folks, the claret has begun to flow." Pete was yelling or screaming or both. For several seconds, the overturned Scout's engine continued to run, then gravity did its work and the motor died. Now it was just an overturned hulk in the road, wheels still spinning, lights shining at the snow-loaded trees on the left side of the road. One of them went out, but the other continued to shine. Henry had talked with Jonesy a lot about his accident. Listened, really, therapy was creative listening. And he knew that Jonesy had no memory of the actual collision. As far as Henry could tell, he himself never lost consciousness following the Scout's flip, and the chain of recollection remained intact. He remembered fumbling for the seatbelt clasp, wanting to be all the way free of the fucking thing, while Pete bellowed that his leg was broken. His cock-sucking leg was broken. He remembered the steady wick thump of the windshield wipers and the glow of the dash lights, which were now up instead of down. He found the seatbelt clasp, lost it, found it again, and pushed it. The seatbelt's lap strap released him, and he thumped awkwardly against the roof, shattering the dome light's plastic cover. He flailed with his hand, found the door handle, couldn't move it. My leg, oh man, my fucking leg! Shut up about it, Henry said. Your leg's okay. As if he knew. He found the door handle again, yanked, and there was nothing. Then he realized why he was upside down and yanking the wrong way. He reversed his grip, and the dome light's uncovered bulb glared hotly in his eye as the door clicked open. He shoved the door with the back of his hand. Sure, there would be no result. The frame was probably bent, and he'd be lucky to get 6 inches. But the door grated, and suddenly he could feel snow swirling coldly around his face and neck. He pushed harder on the door, getting his shoulder into it, and it wasn't until his legs came free of the steering column that he realized they had been hung up. He did a half somersault and was suddenly regarding his own denim-covered crotch at close range, as if he had decided to try and kiss his throbbing balls, make them all well. His diaphragm folded in on itself, and it was hard to breathe. "Henry, help me! I'm caught! I'm fucking caught!" "Just a minute!" His voice sounded squeezed and hard, hardly his own voice at all. Now he could see the upper left leg of his jeans darkening with blood. The wind in the pines sounded like God's own Electrolux. He grabbed the doorpost, grateful he'd left his gloves on while he was driving, and gave a tremendous yank. He had to get out, and had to unfold his diaphragm so that he could breathe. For a moment, nothing happened, and then Henry popped out like a cork out of a bottle. He lay where he was for a moment, panting and looking up into a sifting, falling net of snow. There was nothing odd about the sky then. He would have sworn to it in the coat on a stack of Bibles. Just the low grey bellies of the cloud and the psychedelic downrush of the snow. Pete was calling his name again and again with increasing panic. Henry rolled over, got to his knees, and when he went all right, he lurched to his feet. He only stood for a moment, swaying in the wind and waiting to see if his bleeding left leg would buckle and spill him into the snow again. It didn't, and he limped around the back of the overturned Scout to see what he could do about Pete. He spared one glance at the woman who had caused all this fuckerow. She sat as she had, cross-legged in the middle of the road, her thighs and the front of her parka frosted with snow. Her vest snapped and billowed. So did the ribbons attached to her cap. She did not turn to look at them, but stared back in the direction of the Gosling's market, just as she had when they had come over the rise and saw her. One swooping, curving tire track in the snow came within a foot of her cocked left leg, and he had no idea, absolutely none at all, how he could have missed her. "Henry! Henry! Help me!" He hurried on, slipped in the new snow as he rounded the passenger side. Pete's door was stuck, but when Henry got on his knees and yanked his both hands, it came open about halfway. He reached in, grabbed Pete's shoulder and yanked. Nothing. "Unbuckle your belt, Pete!" Pete fumbled, but couldn't seem to find it, even though it was right in front of him. Working carefully, with not the slightest feeling of impatience, he supposed he might be in shock, Henry unclipped the belt and Pete thumped to the roof, his head bending sideways. He screamed in mingled surprise and pain, and then came floundering and yanking his way out of the half-open door. Henry grabbed him under his arms and pulled backward. They both went over in the snow, and Henry was afflicted with déjà vu so strong and so sudden it was like swooning. Hadn't they played just this way as kids? Of course they had. The day they had taught duddits how to make snow angels, for one. Someone began to laugh, startling him badly. Then he realized it was him. Pete sat up, wild-eyed and glowering, the back of him covered with snow. "The fuck are you laughing about? That asshole almost got us killed. I'm gonna strangle this son of a bitch." "Not the son, but the bitch herself," Henry said. He was laughing harder than ever and thought it was quite likely that Pete didn't understand what he was saying, especially with the wind thrown in, but he didn't care. Seldom had he felt so delicious. Pete flailed to his feet as much as Henry had done himself, and Henry was just about to say something wise, something about how Pete was moving pretty well for a guy with a broken leg, when Pete went down with a cry of pain. Henry went to him and felt Pete's leg, thrust out in front of him. It seemed intact, but who could tell through the 2 layers of clothing? "It ain't broke after all," Pete said, but he was panting with pain. "Fuckers locked up is all, just like when I was playing football." "Where is she? You sure it's a woman?" "Yes." Pete got up and hobbled around the front of the car holding his knee. The remaining headlight still shone bravely into the snow. "She better be crippled or blind, that's all I can say," he told Henry. "If she's not, I'm gonna kick her ass all the way back to Gosling's." Henry began to laugh again. It was the mental picture of Pete hopping and then kicking, like some fucked up rocket. "Pete, don't you really hurt her?" he shouted, suspecting any severity he might have managed by negating the fact that he was speaking between gusts of maniacal laughter. "I won't, unless she puts some sass on me," Pete said. The words carried back to Henry on the wind had an offended old lady quality to them, and that made him laugh harder than ever. He scooted down his jeans and long underwear and stood there in his jockeys to see how badly the turn signal stalk had wounded him. It was a shallow gash about 3 inches long on the inside of his thigh. It had bled copiously and was still oozing, but Henry didn't think it was deep. "What in the hell do you think you were doing?" Pete scolded from the other side of the overturned Scout. Those wipers were still wick-thumping back and forth. And although Pete's tirade was laced with profanity, much of it decidedly beaverish, his friend still sounded to Henry like an offended old lady schoolteacher, and this got him laughing again as he hauled up his breeches. "Why are you sitting here in the middle of the motherfucking road in the middle of a motherfucking snowstorm? You drunk? High on drugs? What kind of a dumb doodly fuck are you? Hey, talk to me! You almost got me and my buddy killed, and at least you can do, oh, fuck me, Freddy!" Henry came around the back just in time to see Pete fall over beside Miss Buddha. His leg must have locked up again. She never looked at him. The orange ribbons on her hat blew out behind her. Her face was raised into the storm, wide eyes not blinking as the snowflakes whirled into them to melt on their warm living lenses. And Henry felt, in spite of everything, his professional curiosity aroused. Just what had they found here? "Oh, fuck me sideways. Shit a goddamn. Don't that fucking hurt?" "Are you all right?" Henry asked, and that started him laughing again. What a foolish question. Do I sound all right, shrink boy? Pete asked waspishly, but when Henry bent toward him, he raised one hand and waved him away. Nah, I got it. It's letting go. Check Princess dipshit. She just sits there. Henry dropped to his knees in front of the woman, wincing at the pain. His legs, yes, but his shoulder also hurt where he had banged it on the roof, and his neck was stiffening rapidly, but still chuckling. This was no dewy damsel in distress. She was 40 at least, and heavy-set. Although her parka was thick and she was wearing God knows how many layers beneath it, it swelled noticeably in front, indicating the sort of a prodigious jugs for which breast reduction surgery had been made. The hair whipping out from beneath and around the flaps of her cap was cut in no particular style. Like them, she was wearing jeans, but one of her thighs could have made two of Henry's. The first word to occur to him was countrywoman, the kind of a woman you saw hanging out her wash in the toy-littered yard beside her double-wide trailer while Garth or Shania blared her radio stuck in an open window, or maybe buying a few groceries at Gosselin's. The orange gear suggested she might have been hunting, but if so, where is her rifle? Already covered in snow? Her wide eyes were dark blue and utterly blank. Henry looked for her tracks and saw none. The wind had erased them, no doubt, but it was still eerie. She might have been dropped from the sky. Henry pulled his glove off and snapped his fingers in front of those staring eyes. They blinked. It wasn't much, but more than what he had expected, given the fact that a multi-ton vehicle had just missed her by inches and never a twitch from her. "Hey!" he shouted in her face. "Hey, come back! Come back!" He snapped his fingers again and could hardly feel them. When had it turned so cold? We are in a goddamn situation here, he thought. The woman burped. The sound was staringly loud, even with the wind in the trees, and before it was snatched away by the moving air, he got a whiff of something both bitter and pungent. It smelled like medicinal alcohol. The woman shifted and grimaced, then broke wind. A long, purring fart that sounded like ripping cloth. Maybe, Henry thought, that's how the locals say hello. The idea got him laughing again. "Holy shit," Pete said, almost in his ear. "Sounds like she ripped out the seat of her pants with that one. What have you been drinking, lady? Prestone?" And then to Henry. She'd been drinking something, by Christ, and if that ain't antifreeze, I'm a monkey. Henry could smell it too. The woman's eyes suddenly shifted, met Henry's own. He was shocked by the pain he saw in them. "Where's Rick?" she asked. "I have to find Rick. He's the only one left." She grimaced, and when her lips peeled back, Henry saw half of her teeth were gone. Those remaining looked like stakes in a dilapidated fence. She belched again, and the smell was strong enough to make his eyes water. "Ah, holy Christ!" Pete nearly screamed. "What's wrong with her?" "I don't know," Henry said. The only things he knew for sure was that the woman's eyes had gone blank again, and they were in a goddamn situation here. Had he been alone, he might have considered sitting down next to the woman and putting his arm around her. A much more interesting and unique answer to the final problem than the Hemingway solution. But there was Pete to think about. Pete hadn't even been through his first alcohol rehab yet, although that was undoubtedly in the cards. And besides, he was curious. Pete was sitting in the snow, working at his knee again, with his hands looking at Henry, waiting for him to do something, which was fair enough since so often he had been the idea man of their quartet. They hadn't had a leader, but Henry had been the closest thing to it. Even back in junior high school, that had been true. The woman, meanwhile, was looking at no one, just staring off in the snow again. Settle, Henry thought. Just take a deep breath and settle. He took the breath, held it, and let it out. Better. A little better. All right. What is up with this lady? Never mind where she'd come from, what she was doing here, or why she smelled like diluted antifreeze when she burped. What is up with her right now? Shock, obviously. Shock so deep, it was like a form of catatonia. Witness how she had not much as stirred when the scout went skidding by her at shaving distance. And yet, she hadn't retreated so far inside that only a hypo of something excitable could reach her. She had responded to the snap of his fingers, and she had spoken, had inquired about someone named Rick. Henry, quite a minute. He took off his gloves again, held his hands in front of her face, and clapped them smartly. He thought the sound very small as compared to the steady whoosh of winds in the trees, but she blinked again. On your feet. Henry took her gloved hands and was encouraged when they were closed reflexively around his. He leaned forward, getting into her face, smelling that ethery odor. No one smelled like that, could be very well. On your feet, get up, with me, on 3, 1, 2, 3. He stood up, holding her hands. She rose, her knees popping, and burped again. She broke wind again as well. Her hat went askew, dipping over one eye. When she made no move to straighten it, Henry said, "Fix her hat." Huh? Pete had also gotten up, although he didn't look very steady. "I don't want to let go of her. Fix her hat. Get it out of her eye." Gingerly, Pete reached out and straightened her hat. The woman bent slightly, grimaced, farted. "Thank you very much," Pete said sourly. "You've been a wonderful audience. Good night." Henry could feel her sagging and tightened his grip. "Walk!" he shouted, getting into her face again. "Walk with me. On 3, 1, 2, 3. He began walking backwards towards the front of the Scout. She was looking at him now, and he held her gaze. Without glancing at Pete, he didn't want to risk losing her. He said, "Take my belt. Lead me." "Where?" "Around the other side of the Scout." "I'm not sure I can." "You have to, Pete. Now do it." For a moment there was nothing, and then he felt Pete's hand slip under his coat, fumble, and catch hold of his belt. They shuffled across the narrow string of road in an awkward conga line, through the staring yellow spotlight of the Scout's remaining headlamp. On the far side of the overturned vehicle, they were at least partly sheltered from the wind, and that was good. The woman abruptly pulled her hands out of Henry's and leaned forward, mouth opening. Henry stepped back, not wanting to be splattered when she let go. But instead of vomiting, she belched, the loudest one yet. Then, while still bent over, she broke wind again. The sound was like nothing Henry had ever heard before. And he would have sworn he heard everything on the wards in western Massachusetts. She kept her feet, though, breathing through her nose in a big, horse-like snuffles of air. "Henry," Pete said. His voice was hoarse with terror, awe, or both. "My God, look!" He was staring up at the sky, jaw loose and mouth gaping. Henry followed his gaze and could hardly believe what he was seeing. Bright circles of light, 9 or 10 of them, cruised slowly across the low-hanging clouds. Henry had to squint to look at them. He thought briefly of spotlights stabbing the night sky at Hollywood film premieres. But of course, there was no such lights out here in the woods. And if there had been, he would have seen the beams themselves, rising in the snowy air. Whatever was projecting those lights was above in the clouds, not below them. They ran back and forth, seemingly at random, and Henry felt a sudden, atavistic terror invade him. Except it actually seemed to rise from inside, somewhere deep inside. All at once, his spinal cord felt like a column of ice. "What is it?" Pete said, nearly whining. "Christ, Henry, what is it?" I don't." The woman looked up, saw the dancing lights, and began to shriek. They were amazingly loud, those shrieks, and full of terror. They made Henry feel like shrieking himself. "They're back!" she screamed. "They're back! They're back!" She covered her eyes and put her head against the front tire of the overturned Scout. She quit screaming and only moaned, like something caught in the trap with no hope of getting free. For some unknown length of time, probably not more than 5 minutes, although it felt longer, they watched those brilliant lights run across the sky, circling, skidding, hanging lefts and rights, appearing to leapfrog each other. At some point, Henry became aware there were only 5 instead of nearly a dozen, and then there were only 3. Beside him, the woman with her face against the tire, farted again, and Henry realized they were standing out here in the middle of nowhere, gawping at some sort of storm-related celestial phenomenon which, while interesting, would contribute absolutely nothing towards getting them into a place that was dry and warm. He could remember the final reading on the trip meter with perfect clarity, 12.7. They were nearly 10 miles from the hole in the wall, a good hike under the best of circumstances. And here, they were in a storm only 2 steps below a blizzard. Plus, he thought, I'm the only one who can walk. Pete. Pete breathed. They're fucking UFOs just like on the X-Files. What do you suppose? Pete! He took Pete's chin in his hand and turned his face away from the sky to his own. Overhead, the last 2 lights were paling. It's some sort of electrical phenomenon, that's all. You think? Pete looked absurdly disappointed. Yeah, something related to the storm, but even if it's the first wave of butterfly aliens from planet Olnitok, it isn't going to make any difference to us if we turn into popsicles out here. Now I need you to help me. I need you to do that trick of yours. Can you? I don't know, Pete said, venturing one final look at the sky. There was only one light now, so dim you wouldn't have known it was there if you hadn't been looking for it. Ma'am, they're almost gone. Mellow out, okay? She made no reply, only stood with her face pressed against the tire. The streamers on her hat flapped and flew. Pete sighed and turned to Henry. What do you want? You know the logger shelters along this road? There were 8 or 9 of them. Henry thought nothing but 4 posts each with pieces of rusty corrugated tin on top for roofs. The pulpers stowed cut logs or pieces of equipment beneath them until spring. Sure, Pete said. Where's the closest one, can you tell me? Pete closed his eyes, raised one finger, and began moving it back and forth. At the same time, he made a little ticking sound with the tip of his tongue against the roof of his mouth. This had been the part of Pete ever since high school. It didn't go back as far as Beaver's gnawed pencils and chewed toothpicks, or Jonesy's love for horror movies and murder stories, but it went back a long way. It was usually reliable. Henry waited, hoping it would be reliable now. The woman, her ears perhaps catching that small regular ticking sound beneath the boom of the wind, raised her head and looked around. There was a large, dark smear across her forehead from the tire. At last, Pete opened his eyes. Right up there, he said, pointing in the direction of hole in the wall. Go around that curve and there's a hill. Go down the other side of the hill and there's a straight stretch. At the end of the straight, there's one of those shelters. It's on the left. Part of the roof's fallen in. A man named Stevenson had a nosebleed there once. Yeah? Oh man, I don't know. And Pete looked away, as if embarrassed. Henry vaguely remembered the shelter, and the fact that the roof had partially fallen in for good. Or could be, if it had fallen the right way, it would have turned the wall less shelter into a lean-to. How far? Half a mile, maybe 3/4. And you're sure? Yeah. Can you walk that far on your knee? I think so, but will she? She better, Henry said. He put his hands on the woman's shoulder, turned her wide-eyed face to his, and moved in until they were almost nose to nose. The smell of her breath was awful, antifreeze with something oily and organic beneath it. But he stayed close and made no move to draw back. We need to walk, he told her, not quite shouting, but speaking loudly and in a tone of command. Walk with me now, on 3. 1, 2, 3. He took her hand and held her back around the Scout and into the road. There was one moment of resistance, and then she followed with perfect docility, not seeming to feel the push of the wind when it struck them. They walked for about 5 minutes, Henry holding the woman's gloved right hand in the left one, and then Pete lurched. Wait, he said. Bastardly knees trying to lock upon me again. While he bent and massaged it, Henry looked up at the sky. There were no lights up there now. Are you all right? Can you make it? I'll make it, Pete said. Come on, let's go.